Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on Mint Press. As you know, we are weekly going against the grain, covering stories which are regularly ignored by the mainstream media. For that reason, we are reliant upon your support. So please like, share, and subscribe, and also support what Mint Press does through our Patreon page. Now, this week, we are joined by a fascinating guest who has very kindly given us some of his time today. Todd E Pierce, former Judge Advocate General, retired from the US Army, an illustrious career which took him to defending 3 detainees in Guantanamo Bay. A lot of interesting stuff has been written by Todd. You can access it on Consortium News, another great website, which is a good friend of Mint Press, and also Mondewees. So today, to start with, it would be great, Todd, just to understand some of your own trajectory. And if we can look at how the Gulf War for you served as a bit of a turning point.
Just as a very quick biography, short, I grew up in Minnesota. My father had been in World War II on the Bataan Death March, spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp of Japanese, was tortured and everything, and was rescued by American and Filipino forces in January of 1945. The Filipinos were known as guerrillas. They would have been known as terrorists had the United States Army military been defining them in this century. That's how we called anybody who resisted, military occupiers. We called them terrorists, like in Iraq. So anyway, I enlisted very quickly. I'll tell you, I enlisted in the Marine Corps when I was 17 years old. I would have been a child soldier, in my senior year of high school. Failed my physical that first time and ended up going in the Marine Reserve a couple years later, having turned against the Vietnam War. And having been a pretty liberal person in the 1970s, but gradually, as with so many other Americans, was becoming more conservative under the exaggerated, threat of the Soviet Union, et cetera. But anyway, so I entered the Army Reserve then in about 1982 and to become a computer programmer, which led me to, sorry for the long story, to the Gulf War in 1990 as a computer specialist with the 321st Material Management Center. So we were deployed almost immediately after, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and I spent about 11 months then in Dammam, Saudi Arabia, but having opportunity to get around and seeing quite a bit while I was there, being both before the war, after the war, and somewhat during the war.
You also mentioned the establishment of US military bases as a kind of stranglehold around Iraq, and the Gulf War serving as a pretext to do that. Could you tell us a little bit about what you saw during that process?
So, our unit, so the war ended in February of 1991. Our unit didn't leave Saudi Arabia until about August 1st, 1991. We were probably the longest serving, or one of the very longest serving units there. And the reason we were there for so long was because we were then establishing all these, a number of logistics bases throughout the area, northern Saudi Arabia, but also in Kuwait. The term used to be used as power projection platforms from any place where the United States could launch power from. And that's what these really were, power projection platforms that the United States was setting up. So again, at Kuwait, a huge camp in northern Saudi Arabia, and at the Dhahran Air Base, the United States military was totally infused into Saudi Arabia, which of course is what Osama bin Laden would eventually take umbrage at, and was one of the reasons he articulated for why he saw the United States as needing to be attacked. In addition to these, I'll call them these bases, these power projection platforms, was the active involvement with the United States in the Saudi Arabian government. So in a lot of ways, you could say Saudi Arabia had lost its sovereignty. And again, that was one of the issues raised by bin Laden to justify, explain his attack, on 9/11. So I was witness to that. One quick point I'd like to say, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm going to put in that disclaimer, but I was told the United States was ready, had the war gone against us, we were ready to use tactical nuclear weapons, which I think is relevant given today we're making all the accusations. I mean, Russia said, well, if needed, they would, and there's a whole lot of sort of hysteria. How dare they say something like that? Well, it's always been U.S. policy to be willing to use first use of nuclear weapons in the event that our conventional forces were being defeated. So I think that's important for people to keep in mind these days.
And just for confirmation, your source for this idea that you have of the tactical use of nuclear weapons or the possibility of it, what is that source?
Well, it's nothing that I saw that was classified. So I'm not, I don't even want to say much about it, except that I knew it was a possibility, and my source was somebody who would have known.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Todd. It's also interesting that you spent time in the psychological operations of the US military. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, actually, like I say, in the 1980s, actually an Israeli Defense Force officer who was teaching political science at the University of Minnesota at the time, really, I can say, is who introduced me to neoconservatism. I had becoming more, I had gone into the Army Reserve and had been on active duty then as a result of that. And that's where I spent my active duty time as part of that. It's a different program. I won't go into all the details of that. But so I'd begun reading in a 5-month course down at Georgia, the magazines that would be in the military library, typical. And those would be conservative magazines, very hawkish on national security. And so I was already leaning that way, becoming more of a hawk in the 1980s. And then I came back to Minnesota after that training. And I met this Israeli Defense Force officer who was teaching at the university. And he introduced me, I'll say, to neoconservatism and selling me on those ideas. And again, I can't accept too much blame for that. A whole lot of people were influenced by that. Given the context of the times, it seemed somewhat reasonable. I was very pro-Israel. As I mentioned you mentioned Mono Weiss, as I mentioned, told Phil Weiss. And so that introduced me to neoconservatism. And in the course of that, I became more involved, you could say, with the Army Air Force Center for Low Intensity Conflict. They were involved. Actually, I reached out to them, but they were involved with things like a study of psychological operations. And so I became, you could say, a volunteer and introduced them to a person who I'd become friends with, a former Sandinista, a Marxist, who had, broke with the Sandinistas and had moved to the United States to study for a PhD, where I became acquainted with him. And anyway, he was a real expert, you could say, on psychological operations. That's what he had been doing in his studies in Europe, working in political theory on behalf of the Sandinistas. And so he was the real expert that I've met on psychological operations. But the term now being used, and I think it originated in Israel, cognitive warfare. And the term has been adopted by the United States and NATO. If you do a search online for cognitive warfare, you will find a number of interesting articles coming up. Now, they all project it onto Russia and China, of course. But if you read it and realize that what they're saying when it comes to Russia or China is really a projection of what we're doing. Because I've had this long interest in psychological operations and political warfare, going back to being a kid for some weird reason, I've read a lot about it. And, we had this hysteria growing over the last 2 decades of Russia's information warfare, as if they invented it. And you read Rand Corporation, which was really it was featured, you could say, in Dr. Strangelove, called the Bland Corporation there. Totally military madness, perfect example of military madness. Though they're a civilian group, they were founded by the Air Force. And anyway, they routinely, in the 1990s, long before Russia was even off of its knees, after our shock doctrine economics broke them, the Rand Corporation was selling this idea that we have to wage information warfare against the world. And that's really what it means, against the world. I go on talking quite a bit, so interrupt me if you need to. But in 1992, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Zalmay Khalilzad, and Scooter Libby all got together to come up with a justification for why the United States could not cut military spending, even though the Cold War had ended. You can find it readily on doing a search on draft defense planning guidance. And what they said, and it was leaked, the document was leaked. And so our allies objected because it was saying that the world now is subject to our military control, and we would not tolerate any country even having the ability. Came up in a document past my desk one day. We would not tolerate any country even having the ability could cause us to hesitate in our decision making, even for legitimate grievances. It's totalitarian. It was a totalitarian doctrine that was imposed. We were trying to impose it upon the world, and it's still our doctrine. Because of the being leaked, Zalmay Khalilzad says in his memoir that, they had to rewrite it a little bit, but they didn't change the meaning in any way. Then it reappeared as the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, which, again, doesn't go away. It just, unless it's specifically repealed. So it's still there. That's the way of thinking, the worldview of the United States, that we do rule the world, and you all are subject to U.S. military domination and control, and at our total, you're subject to our deference on how that will be exercised.
Well, this kind of leads us to this question of unitary executive theory. Could you break down for us what exactly that is and how relevant that is to post 9/11 US foreign policy?
Well, you being in Britain, right? You know it better than I do, to the degree you studied English history, the monarchies, and it's exactly that. The unitary executive is a dictator. It came out of Dick Cheney, as Dick Cheney has said, out of the Minority Report from the Iran-Contra investigation by Congress back in the mid-1980s. The congressional report criticized the United States for what it had done. Dick Cheney and a good number of the Republicans provided a minority report. And in it, they described what was the unitary executive theory, the idea that the U.S. president can do anything he or she wishes to do. And it's no less than that. It is a dictatorship. In the 2000s, remarkably, I shouldn't say remarkably because it came out of this culture of this. People in the United States were resurrecting Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a German legal theorist who belonged to the Nazi Party for a while. But I think it is correct to say, because his apologists would say, well, he wasn't really a Nazi. But what they didn't say was, but he was, in fact, the true fascist. He was a genuine fascist. He wasn't as critical of, he wasn't a anti-Semite like the mass majority of the Nazi Party was. In fact, he was friends with Leo Strauss, who emigrated to the United States and became known, his group of admirers, theorists, became known as the Straussians, which of course the Bush administration drew upon heavily, and of course is still there and influenced both parties. This is not just a Republican Party thing. We can see the extreme militarists and the Democrats right today. But they came out of the same ideological sources of the 1950s. And we won't go into that too much, but the founders of the National Review magazine was very, a number of them were former CIA officers. And you can almost think, and it's been suggested by others way back in the time, that it was a CIA influence operation because they intended to lead people's thinking toward a more militaristic way of thinking. And they influenced people in the Democratic Party, like slipping my mind at the moment, but he wrote something about about geopolitics. Anyway, but the point being is, the Scoop Jackson Democrats were modeled after the most extreme militaristic Republicans, the conservative movement. And that's what we have really a preponderance of overwhelmingly in the Republicans today and almost overwhelmingly in the Democratic Party, meaning the country today, the United States, has become an extremely militaristic country in a way that Mussolini had defined as fascist.
Wow. And how did your journey, both intellectually and in terms of work, take you to serve as the defense for 3 detainees or prisoners or kidnapped victims, some would say, at Guantanamo Bay?
So when I was in Saudi Arabia, 1990-91, I took every advantage to get out and meet people, speak to people. I was invited out for dinner from different people. I had a chance to get a different viewpoint than I would ordinarily than I ever got in Minnesota, and realized, it was opening my eyes to the wider world. And Hannah Arendt would always say, you have to see yourself through others' eyes. And it helped me see, ourselves through others' eyes. And it just opened up another way of thinking. And then throughout the 1990s, I saw the wars weren't ending. I went into the PSYOP unit. I got all my training up to the level of senior PSYOP NCO. But in about 1995, our commander came back from a conference and he told us, well, even though the Cold War ended, don't get the idea that our mission tempo is going to slow down. It's going to increase, as a matter of fact. And what we were seeing and now know was during the 1990s, United States, no longer having a Cold War opponent, a rival, really saw itself able to do whatever it wanted in the world anymore, from there on, without any resistance that they thought. And so we were, Somalia, that was presented as a humanitarian mission, but even when these things are presented as, and even has a sliver of so-called humanitarianism, it's always with the overriding objective of expanding U.S. military reach. And so, there's a reason why we have 800, 900 military, maybe more than 900 military bases around the world. Each one is like it's a power projection platform, you can say, a lily pond, lily pad. So we really are around the world right now. Just reading today on a website news source from the Pentagon, actually, of how we're changing a division up in Alaska, into a paratrooper unit. But the point is, they've been writing about for years now of how the United States sees the Arctic as the next frontier for us to control, with obviously Russia there as a potential rival, which might give you a understanding of the geopolitical thinking that goes into, well, why are we using a proxy force now in Ukraine to fight the Russians? I won't even get into all that, but again, you have to look at everything in a larger geopolitical sense of how the United States sees itself in the world and how it sees itself as having a right to subjugate the world. That we are owed deference by everyone else in the world, which goes to the Unitary executive theory.
And this led you to advocate for the rights of those in Guantanamo Bay. Yes,
exactly. Well, more in a number of other factors, but when 9/11 happened, I saw a hysteria take over my fellow officers. I was in a reserve command, but bear in mind the reserves have a lot of active duty people, and that's how I served most of my time on active duty, attached to a reserve unit. And so regular Army and reserve officers on active duty and just in reserve duty, I saw this hysteria take over in 9/11. I was just developing through the day, and I knew this was going to end poorly. Whatever needed to be done, it did not require a military operation of the sort that we used as a pretext to expand the war to the very 7 nations that the Project for the New American Century had been calling to be defeated for a number of years, beginning in Israel, with a plan that they'd come up with, when Menachem Begin became PM back in 82, a person advocated that they just go in and fragment the Mideast, leaving no one there to oppose Israel. Well, American neoconservatives like Richard Pearl advised the same thing to Netanyahu when he came into power as PM, but they are also advocating that within the United States. Project for the New American Century provided some documents in the 1990s calling for the destruction of these Mideast countries and also eventually Russia and China. So let's not think that there's an accident or that Russia and China did something and now we have to turn our attention to them, but rather they were always on the target list. We're just getting around to them now that we've defeated the Mideast or fragmented the Mideast, with, of course, Iran still to go in the Mideast. But seeing that and then reading everything coming out about the, what we were going to do with the prisoners and all the pronouncements by Cheney and all these people, I just knew. And again, it brought back ideas of the Japanese imperial military that kept my dad imprisoned and tortured him. So it's like we adopted the very same policies of the people whom had tortured my father. And we threw away the rule of law, Geneva Conventions. All these things are openly being talked about by the Republicans that and saying things like the Geneva Conventions are quaint. All these things motivated me to think, well, how can I do something? Actually, I could have resigned my commission. Nobody would have paid attention and I'd slunk off. But I knew there'd eventually be military commissions. So I thought I'd stay and volunteer when the opportunity came. And I did in 2008. And I'm still on an appellate case in regard to that.
So the question that I wanted to ask leading on from what you just said was, what do you make of an organization like Lockheed Martin, for example, which was involved in the interrogation of suspects at Guantanamo Bay, whose value increased by over 1,000% throughout the war on terror, being given the contract for making and working on the census in this country in 2010, or for example, Khaki International, which half of the interrogators at Abu Ghraib were working for, being given just 4 years after the scandal at Abu Ghraib, going on to get the deal for the census in Scotland. Do you view companies like that who have been involved in these kind of operations as anywhere near trustworthy to be working on the census for populations like Britain and Scotland?
Absolutely not. Nobody, I don't think virtually anybody can grasp the scope of these companies, and particularly Lockheed Martin. President Eisenhower, former general, coined the phrase military industrial complex. Lockheed Martin epitomizes that. If you ever saw the movie Catch 22, there's a character in there who's building a corporation, and he's letting everybody know that everything matters. Only what matters is what's good for the company, not the war effort or anything else. Lockheed Martin, when I got my retirement physical, I get all done, and then I see this cup holder, setting Lockheed Martin. The clinic belonged to Lockheed Martin. They've got their tentacles into everything. And they're only just one corporation that's like that, maybe the biggest one, but you cannot even grasp how deeply embedded these corporations are in national security policy, making national security policy. We're not a democracy. I recommend people read Sheldon Wolin, Princeton University political theorist, who coined the phrase inverted totalitarianism in 2003 to describe the United States, and came back and about 10 years later and say, yeah, under Obama, it hasn't changed. And before I forget, General Wesley Clark, whom I would criticize on a whole range of reasons, but you can find him on YouTube as talking about the Project for the New American Century, how they came to, had so much influence in the Pentagon to attack and destroy 7 countries in the Mideast. And you can see that we actually followed that, script. But yeah, it's amazing. It's hard to express how huge this is, and we still believe that we are a democracy. When we want to go to war, again, cognitive warfare, it's not necessarily something quick like we may think of. It builds up, constantly. And the Rand Corporation explained that there's a constant matter of conditioning the battlefield, the battlefield being public opinion. So you have to get public opinion in the direction that you want it to go. And then when you do that, it doesn't take anything to get us into war.
I mean, the interesting thing about the influencing of public opinion is that one could assume that Hollywood would be a major vector of that. And when we think of the Rand Corporation, you had Sony Pictures Entertainment for many years run right at the top by Michael Linton, who, simultaneous to being right at the top of Sony Pictures Entertainment, was on the board of the Rand Corporation. And so then we see the documents made public that over 800 Hollywood films had taken place with some element of basically co-production duties carried out by either the Department of Defense or the CIA, or other sort of insinuations of the US security state. It would also be interesting to see what you think of what is the relevance today of the Espionage Act of 1917. Of course, we can't forget that Eugene Debs was imprisoned under the Espionage Act during World War I and ran for president and got about 1 million votes during that time. Also, another interesting point about Sheldon Wallen's inverted totalitarianism is it's the idea that we do not have the option of voting against the interests of organizations like Lockheed Martin or Khaki International and others. But yeah, Todd, if you could just speak to that point about the Espionage Act, please.
So recognize, during the Civil War, we had martial law in the North declared by Lincoln. Now, to be clear, the Confederacy, the South, always had martial law because that's what slavery was, a form of martial law. Ultimately, the slaves were kept in captivity at the point of a bayonet, of the United States military. So the South was always under martial law, and you could not be an abolitionist in the South and freely express your opinions without having faced a lot of serious consequences. So, but the point is, during wartime, the martial law commentators talked about how martial law inherently comes along with wartime, giving the commanders, which in most countries, may be civilians, may not, but whoever is in charge of the military, giving them the right to do anything that they feel necessary to prosecute the war. That always begins with suppressing free speech, any dissent. And so during the Civil War, we had martial law. Well, that fell into such disrepute following the Civil War that nobody wanted to declare martial law again, at least in that period of time. So the Filipino-Spanish-American War comes, and the collateral consequence of that was then the Philippine-American War, because the United States then purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, and we began implementing our own militaristic state upon the Filipinos, which they resisted. So we declared martial law. Horrendous acts were done in Philippines and in Cuba and Puerto Rico, all on the basis that, well, you're now our possession, and we're going to suppress any dissent to that as harshly as necessary. So when, but that got a lot of criticism too. So when World War I was coming along, there was a lot of opposition to it in the United States, quite a bit. And so they couldn't declare a martial law to suppress dissent. But even, well before the war was even beginning, importing from the Philippines these various measures that had been used to suppress dissent in the Philippines, began proposing laws that would implement them. And what they really were sedition laws, anti-sedition laws, to suppress any dissent. Cleverly, I'll say, they called it the Espionage Act, only changing it to, adding to the Sedition Act like a year after 1918. After the 1917 Espionage Act was passed, but always embedded, even before the Sedition Act was added, within the Espionage Act were provisions for suppressing any dissent exercised by free speech. And they only, the 1918 Sedition Act only strengthened those controls. When they, after the Debs, issues and all that, and again, it fell into disrepute, these sort of measures, they eliminated the Sedition Act title as part of the title and just called it the Espionage Act. But if you read it closely, it reaches anybody who might possess even information. So reading the WikiLeaks, for example, that was forbidden to me as a military officer to the entire U.S. military. We weren't allowed to read WikiLeaks. And again, the whole point is, and it goes back to the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War generals came out of it having lost a war that was never possible to win, and declared that they would have won, but for the stab in the back. That was exactly what Ludendorff had coined as a phrase for why Germany lost World War I, which is preposterous, and won't go into the reasons why. but Ludendorff is certainly largely responsible for losing it. And just like the Vietnam War generals were responsible for losing the U.S. generals, so they come up with a stab in the back legend. And but they couldn't call it that because of the previous experience in Germany. So they just cleverly wrote various things that we lost our will. You know, the will is what the military deems to be the most important element in a war, more important than missiles, tanks. It's the will of the people to fight the war and win. And so they declared that the will had been lost, subverted by the media, the anti-war movement. And so they began, coming up with new ways of imposing their will upon us by direct measures and indirect, including like through movies. So Top Gun, the movie Top Gun, which is just being a new one coming out again with immense U.S. military support. Top Gun was one sort of the first shot fired across the bow, so to speak, at the American people to condition our way of thinking in a pro-war way, in a military industrial complex favorable way. And it's been going on ever since. Zero Dark 30, perhaps one of the most egregious examples of that, which I would argue is a war crime in itself, because a whole lot of war crimes being committed by the United States, including incitement to aggressive war, which is a war crime. And we've been doing that for 20 years, or 20 plus years, if you want, not considering previous years of multiple wars, et cetera. So yes, the Espionage Act has been using, and this was clearly made by the Department of Justice when they, in the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit, a case brought by Noam Chomsky, Dan Ellsberg, Chris Hedges, and some other activists from Europe for injunctive relief because Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which becomes public law even though the year passes, provided that for military detention pending disposition under the law of war for anybody who, I forget the exact language, but basically is aiding terrorism. And again, unless you understand how speech is deemed a weapon in warfare, you might not grasp the significance of it. But the Department of Justice lawyer came right out and said, yes, Noam Chomsky, Ellsberg, they could be put into military imprisonment pending disposition of the law of war, which doesn't mean anything. It just means forever if the military commander or the commander in chief, the president, says so. So it's a system, totalitarian system already in place. They call it turnkey totalitarianism. I'm surprised that Trump didn't actually use it. At least as far as we know, he might have. And it could have been classified, and we don't know. But the point being is, and I have no more faith in Joe Biden today. But the point is, we have a law on the books that provides for military detention, which is a form of martial law, already here, fully explained by the Department of Justice as exactly that.
Extraordinary testimony. Thank you for that, Todd. It would be interesting to know what the extent of the collaboration between Israeli and US police agencies is and how you believe it has affected US policing, with particular mention of Chicago.
There is regular, and if I'd have known, expected the question, I would have looked. I think the article mentions who talked about it. But there's a regular exchange program. I shouldn't say exchange program, regular sending US police officers to Israel for training. It's coordinated by a organization here in the United States, which is extremely extreme. The
ADL.
Pardon?
Is it the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League?
No, another organization which regularly coordinates, works with the Israeli military. One of the people who writes from one of their publications once had something by a retired Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters of the U.S. Army calling for the killing even of journalists. I've got that. If you look at some of my articles, I mentioned that elsewhere. That's how extreme this organization is. But anyway, so they coordinate these sending of police officers over there, and they get training, in police work, but what kind of police work, you have to ask? It's police work and maintaining a military occupation, which basically is no holds barred policing. And then we send them back into a community like Chicago, or, I believe it was the previous Minneapolis, Minnesota police chief has sent people over as part of this program. as far as I know, Derek Chauvin, the one who killed person who killed George Floyd, had never gone. But there's a whole raft of kill training, and people who participated in this or have learned in other ways or direct from Israel who had these programs going on teaching cops a kill mentality. And this was very widespread. I think the article I wrote on Chicago policing maybe mentions that. And so this is what we've been inculcating our military, our civilian police officers in, a kill mentality. And then why would we be surprised that they begin killing people without legal basis? And the most egregious being George Floyd, where he thought he had such impunity that he could kill somebody right in front of a video camera and only smirk about it, So it's, our wars and what the United States calls it now is perpetual war. And of course, it would include China and Russia and is Iran, because we're now talking about pure competitor warfare. We've got such a addiction to war that we got done with the Mideast, so-called global war on terror. Now we're at pure competitor warfare, and our think tanks are always promoting this, whether the so-called Democrat think tanks like Center for New American Security or the right-wing think tanks of Heritage Foundation, Hoover Institute, and too many names to come, but always Rand Corporation. And Rand Corporation, you can call them a bipartisan, pro-war, militaristic, promoting, war criminal organization, I think would be, not too extreme.
Todd E Pierce, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Watchdog. I understand that you have a tight schedule today, so it would be amazing in the future if you had time for us to talk again on more interesting and fascinating topics. Thank you so much for joining us also to the viewers today for The Watchdog on Mint Press. As I say, please like, share, and subscribe, and also keep supporting what we do on Patreon. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, and love to talk to you again.
Thank you.